Another is the Global Health and Security and Diplomacy Act, which is a bipartisan bill going through the Senate, which would add about $3 billion in those coffers. And that's called the Global Health, Security and Diplomacy Act. I think what we see especially is that the world's dictators and autocrats are exploiting the global pandemic, including in Africa, to violate human rights, to attack democracy, to consolidate executive power, to criminalize basic freedoms of speech and assembly. To that end, Representative Raskin stood with bipartisan members of Congress to introduce last week a bill called the Protecting Human Rights During Pandemic Act. And it is a bill that that recognizes that this moment is dangerous for those who are human rights defenders, who are working to uphold the rule of law and to strengthen civilian institutions. They're under attack. So we are, this bill, it provides additional funding to the State Department and USAID to fund human rights defender programs, especially those that are under attack because of coronavirus. And we wanted to make that link between human rights and coronavirus, because this is not just a public health issue. This is an issue of democracy and human rights. And we've seen all across the world and also in Africa, the ways in which unscrupulous leaders are taking advantage of the situation. So the bill also requires that the State Department come up with 5-year strategic plans for how the US government is going to address the issue of human rights violations that are related to coronavirus. And it also requires the State Department to include in our annual human rights reports a section that analyzes any emergency measures taken by a government across the world, and analyzes whether those emergency measures are proper, whether they're proportional, whether they're time limited, whether they follow human rights principles.
David, because 5 more minutes.
Sure. What we've seen is that dictators are just grabbing power. A third thing I'd talk about is the need for the U.S. to support global health initiatives. And on that, Representative Raskin has been very vocally opposed to the U.S. withdrawing from the World Health Organization. As we realize, the WHO is a critical partner to many African governments, and including to the African Union CDC. And we know that the virus observes no borders, and beating it requires a coordinated global response. Representative Raskin's also co-sponsored a few bills in the House, HR 6581, and several letters about directing the U.S. to directing U.S. representatives to multilateral banks like the World Bank and the IMF to have new policies around debt relief for Africa and other markets that will need more economic flexibility right now. And finally, I would just highlight the work that our office is doing with both the Congressional Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which is a bipartisan congressional commission to examine human rights and put them front and center in congressional policy. And also a lot of the varied work that Representative Raskin and our office has done to support democratic movements in Africa. Most notably in Cameroon, Guinea-Conakry, and then also through supporting conflict prevention initiatives. When opposition leaders pass through DC, Representative Raskin is always very eager to meet with them to understand what the U.S. can do to help support the growth of democratic institutions. And Sometimes it gets us into hot water because those opposition politicians go back and rightfully say that they have some support in Washington, but that's a good thing, and we want to see more democratic activists participating, and we're always looking for ways to support that. So I'll just leave it there. I know I'm not as exciting as the congressman, but please know that he sends his regards and wishes he could be here. He's always very excited about grassroots forums like this, where citizens talk and discuss and think big about their future. And he's always there to help support the democracy and development initiatives in Africa as well.
David, you're quite a good speaker, and thank you for sharing these thoughts from the congressman. But I'm going to open up for Q&A. You're here. We certainly appreciate you taking your busy time and opening up your schedule on Capitol Hill. So if anyone would like to unmute and or send me a question, that'd probably be the best, and we'll ask that. But David, let me go ahead and start off while people are thinking about the question. What do you see as maybe 3 outcomes that is possible in this Congress as far as Africa is concerned?
Well,
I know it's putting you on the spot, but anything you can share would be helpful.
I think for one thing, there's going to need to be another coronavirus relief bill. And it is going to hopefully include foreign assistance. Now, the CARES Act, which was passed back in March, was the sort of the big package. And that included some foreign assistance, not nearly enough. And so I think over the next 4 to 8 weeks, both Congress and the Senate are going to really have to get down to work to come up with a bill for the next coronavirus relief. Another thing that I think will come out of Congress this year is going to be a focus on a few countries in Africa that are at really critical pivot or inflection points. Sudan being one of those. There's a lot of focus on trying to support Sudan's transition. Ethiopia is another. And those are sort of countries that are going to take up a lot of bandwidth. And I can't think of a third on the spot, Dr. Hancock, but I'll leave it there.
That's absolutely okay. Anyone else? I was looking to see if we had another question. I guess one last question, since no one else has sent me one, David, is what can this forum and the representatives that you saw on this agenda do to help Congress better understand the needs and the future, not just the needs, but the future of the continent of Africa and its 54 countries?
Well, I think, reading through your very rich agenda and your very rich roster of speakers, what, impresses me is that you don't treat issues in silos. You're not having a panel just about, health or humanitarian assistance. And unfortunately, I'm not a veteran of Congress, so these are new impressions. But it does seem to me that Congress often tends to just deal things in separate categories, especially when it comes to Africa. So we know, as people who have worked on these issues, how much democracy, development, humanitarian issues all intersect, and including intersect with conflict, with climate change, with all sorts of issues. And so just helping to understand that there are people who are working in very complex areas. Otherwise, it can seem overwhelming. I think there's been and then the second thing I would say is just underscoring the need for the U.S. to do more to support all the democratic actors and the democratic institutions. There's really been a focus, rightly so, over the last 3 or 4 months on fixing our systems at home and dealing with the effects of this pandemic at home. And that has come at the expense, I think, of more forward and intelligent thinking about how the U.S. can play a global leadership role. So really underscoring, this is not a choice between helping ourselves and helping others. We're all in this together, and until we beat the virus everywhere, and until the health systems are resilient enough and strong enough everywhere, then it will just come back. So I think we really have to push forward on that next argument, so that the U.S. Congress engages with the world.
So I guess, David, the summary of that is, as we're pushing forward with COVID-19, and we're realizing that maybe some people are trying to advance too rapidly, is that we really need to be slow and steady, look at the science, think carefully about what we're doing, and then move forward. And as far as the African continent and its leap forward in social, economic, and environmental terms, we need to really be in there for the long term in a slow and steady pace. Is that a good summary, David?
I think that's very well put, Dr. Hancock.
Okay. David, thank you very much on behalf of the organizers, everyone that's involved today, those that were here yesterday. We had excellent panels, and those will be here tomorrow. But please pass on our thank yous to the congressman, and I hope all goes well with your legislation and all your work.
Well, thank you all for all you're doing, and happy to stay in touch going forward.